Boldwood presents Sunrise over Strawberry Hill Farm, written by Alison Sherlock, and read by Helen Keeley. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Flora Barton gave her grandmother a wide smile as she tried to pretend that her heart wasn't completely breaking into two.
"Well, these numbers look great, don't you think?"
She lied in an overly bright tone, gesturing at the iPad screen on the kitchen table. Flora and her grandmother, Helen, known to most people as Grams, locked eyes briefly before they both looked away. She couldn't get anything past Grams, so Flora let her fake smile slip as she then turned to their friend Joe with a sigh. Joe Randall was their neighbour in the tiny rural village of Cranfield, in the middle of the English countryside. In addition, he was a great businessman who had achieved success helping quite a few local farms diversify and turn a profit in an increasingly uncertain time in the trade. But some farms were seemingly beyond help, and unfortunately, Strawberry Hill Farm was one of them.
"Thanks for all your hard work sorting this out these past few weeks," Flora told him. "We really appreciate it, especially all the extra hours you had to put in when you're already so busy."
She glanced at the clock and saw that it wasn't even 7 o'clock in the morning yet. Joe had managed to squeeze in a very early meeting with them in his packed diary. Joe gave her a sympathetic smile. "I wish I had been able to do more," he replied, "but at least the decent price we've been offered for the plough means that now all your farming equipment has been sold. You should have enough money to pay off your debts."
"Just the tractor left,"
said Flora, gulping away the emotion which was threatening to overwhelm her. They had sold nearly everything to keep Strawberry Hill Farm afloat, but without any crops to tend, what on earth was she going to do now she wasn't a farmer anymore? It had been her only job since she had left college, so her CV was non-existent. A ray of April sunshine shone through the nearby window as the sun rose over the horizon, lighting up the farmhouse kitchen. After so many months of endless rain, Flora felt as if the weather was mocking her. It was the rain that had done the damage year after year. It had flooded all their fields but two and ruined every crop that they had tried to sow. Without any income from the fields, Strawberry Hill Farm had been running at a loss for a couple of years. They had let their farmhand go to reduce costs, but even that hadn't been enough. The only thing left to keep that left them just the empty fields, slowly being reclaimed by nature and the farmhouse. Their home. Flora glanced over at Grams. Her tiny, elderly grandmother was pulling a baking tray packed with various pastries out of the Aga. When she was little, Flora had been unable to say the word grandma, and so it had become Grams, and the nickname had stuck, even amongst her friends. Grams was 80 years old, but had yet to lose the fierceness which had helped her survive a busy life working the land over many years. However, Flora knew that deep down, Grams' heart was breaking too, over the fate of Strawberry Hill Farm. But whatever happened in the future, she and Grams would always remain together. They had a very close and loving relationship, and despite everything that had been thrown at them, they had hardly ever exchanged a bad word. "Right, who wants a breakfast muffin?" asked Grams, whose baking always filled the farmhouse with its sweet, tempting aroma. She placed a plate piled high with banana and apple muffins in the middle of the large oak table. "Actually, I've got another early meeting to go to," said Joe, standing up and glancing at the muffins with regret. "Shame, really, as you know how much I love your baking." Flora nodded in agreement. Everyone loved Grams' baking. "It's fine," said Grams, reaching up to give him a hug. Her diminutive stature meant that she barely came up to his chest. "I'll pop a few in a bag that you can take with you. You won't keep that business brain of yours whirring on an empty stomach. The right breakfast sets you up for the day." "Try not to worry about the farm," Joe told her, before turning to give Flora a hug. "We'll keep trying to find a way out of all this for you both."
"Thanks,"
murmured Flora, grateful for his kindness. She knew that he had done his best, but some things were just not salvageable. After he had left, Flora looked once more at the plate, which was piled high with double the amount of muffins that Grams normally baked.
"Have you invited the girls for breakfast and not told me?"
asked Flora, raising her eyebrows in surprise.
"Because I'm not sure I'll be able to eat all this by myself."
The girls were her best friends, Harriet, Libby and Katie, who also lived in the tiny hamlet of Cranfield. She had known Harriet and Libby since childhood, and Katie had arrived in the village the previous autumn, at which time their cosy threesome had become an awesome foursome of close friendship and support, and Flora needed their support now, more than ever. Despite everything, at least she and Grams still had their home, she reminded herself, although without any income from the land, even that was now under threat. She glanced around. It was a large but comfortable farmhouse kitchen, full of oak beams, a huge oak table, and the only thing missing was her granddad. Grams and her husband Bill had lived at Strawberry Hill Farm for all of their 60 years of happy marriage. Flora's granddad had inherited the farm from his own parents, and it had been in the family for almost a century. Having lost her mother to illness when she was only 8 years old, Flora had been delighted when she and her father had come to live at the farm soon afterwards. Her grandparents were so steady and loving, in stark contrast to her father, who had sunk into a deep depression after the loss of his wife. He had first remarried a year later, and everything had changed once more. Flora's new, glamorous stepmother had no desire to live on a farm, nor to be the wife of a lowly farmer either. Her dad's own reluctance towards inheriting the family farm had turned into a full-blown crisis when he and Flora's stepmother moved out soon afterwards. That marriage had lasted 6 months, and 2 more had followed since. Her father was always seeking out someone to fill the hole left by the loss of Flora's mother. His search had led him everywhere, but back to Strawberry Hill Farm to visit either his parents or his daughter. Flora knew that the memories of her mother kept him away, but had always secretly hoped that the lure of his only child would have brought him back home. But it had never happened. Left behind, Flora had blossomed under her grandparents' care and attention, and they had encouraged her to pursue her love of art. She had always adored painting, and they had all been delighted that she had received a place at art college. During her first summer break, she had returned from a holiday in Africa, armed with new ideas to freshen up the farmhouse. Consequently, the thick walls of the kitchen were painted bright orange and the cupboard doors a vivid blue. It wasn't the traditional colours for a country kitchen, but her grandparents adored it and suited their sunny natures. But all too soon afterwards, Flora's grandfather had grown ill, leaving Grams overwhelmed with trying to cope with working the land by herself, so Flora had abandoned her art course to return to the farm to help out. When her grandfather passed away a short time later, Grams had tried to encourage her to return to college, but Flora had refused. She would never have wanted to be anywhere else other than by Grams' side when she needed her. She had been young, only 19 years old, and her carefree college days were suddenly over. As Grams grieved for her beloved husband, Flora became aware of the responsibility of ensuring the farm that had been in their family name for over 100 years survived. It was a huge burden and weighed heavily on her young shoulders. So she had even abandoned her beloved painting to work every hour, do anything and everything that she could to help the farm carry on. In fact, she loved working the land, never minding the early starts and late finishes, as it meant that she her favourite times of the day. But any work-life balance was impossible with so much to do. She enjoyed a weekly cocktail session with the girls, but everything else had been sacrificed, and it still didn't feel as if it had been enough, especially now, with the future of the farm so uncertain. Grams brought over a mug of coffee and sat down at the table. "I'm getting things ready for our visitor. Have you forgotten?" she asked. "Lorenzo's grandson is arriving over the next couple of days." Flora made a face as she selected a muffin from the pile and picked at a piece of apple on the top.
"I still don't understand why he's coming here,"
she said. The timing couldn't be worse, and the farmhouse wasn't exactly up to welcoming any visitors.
"Nico is coming here because he's the grandson of one of my oldest friends," Grams told her. "The letter I received last week said that he has something he wants to discuss with me. I have no idea what that is, but of course we will make him welcome.
He couldn't be sure on the exact date when he was going to arrive, but I'm sure he'll be here soon.
So, remind me again, you and Lorenzo were... prompted Flora.
Just good friends, said Grams with a smile to herself. He came to the farm to work during the summer of 1961. We had such fun all those years ago. Your grandfather, Lorenzo, and I. We were all young and carefree, only in our late teens, and we have remained friends ever since, despite Lorenzo returning to Italy that same year. Did I tell you that his son is a very famous footballer over there, and an even more famous playboy? Added Grams, laughing. Can't wait to hear all about that. Paolo Rossi is apparently always in the news over there with his scandalous love life. I'm sure his son has inherited the same good looks and charm that all the Rossi men seem to have. Flora grimaced. The last thing she wanted was some overbearing charmer turning up at the farm. Having been abandoned by her father all those years ago, she had deliberately built a hard shell around her heart to any kind of romance, because if her own father could walk out on her, then surely every other man would do the same. Men were an alien species, to be approached with caution, hard to understand, and always likely to let her down. Apart from her granddad, of course. She missed him terribly, and so did Grams. She looked across at her grandmother. Helen Barton had a weather-worn face, but her eyes sparkled bright against her grey hair and rosy cheeks. I think a playboy might be just what you need, Grams told her with a wicked glint in her green eyes. Have a bit of fun. You're 31 and I can't remember the last time you went on a date. Flora took a bite out of the muffin, the delicious flavour reminding her just how good a cook her grandmother was.
I went out with Tyler Smith last autumn.
Grams rolled her eyes. Tyler is a nice lad and a good farmer, but he's as dull as ditch water, she said with a sad shake of her head. You need someone you can laugh with. That's the one whom you should fall in love with.
Love?
Flora raised an eyebrow at her grandmother.
I haven't got time for love. I need to check on the fields.
Why? Asked Grams, looking surprised. There's nothing growing in them anymore.
I know, but how else can I avoid this awkward conversation?
Said Flora with a wink. She quickly got up and went to walk outside, when she stopped to return to the table to drop a kiss on her grandmother's forehead.
You don't need to worry about me,
she said in a soft voice. I will always worry about you, replied Grams, reaching out to take Flora's hand in hers to give it a tight squeeze. You're our lovely girl, and always will be. I just need to know that you're happy.
Of course I'm happy, said Flora quickly. I'm here with you, aren't I?
Flora squeezed her grandmother's hand before dropping it to walk out of the kitchen door. Once she had pulled on her Wellington boots and shrugged on her wax jacket, she went around the side of the L-shaped farmhouse to walk down the hill on which the farm was set. At this highest part of the farm, the land fell away towards the river in the valley below, and the view was spectacular across the rolling hills and green landscape of the English countryside. The glorious surroundings always kept her calm, especially at that moment when it was bathed in the early morning sunshine. Flora would be heartbroken if they ever had to leave the farm, but if she couldn't find a way of bringing in any income, what choice might they have in the future? She glanced at the strawberry field on her right as she headed down the wide, stony track. The strawberry plants were just peeping up from the ground where she had sown them the previous autumn, but would benefit from being bathed in warm sunshine and the gentle incline which helped drain any rain away. Facing south, this field never flooded, so over the summer, the bright red fruits which had given the farm its name all those years ago were the only crop which made any profit. Further across, the next field was much larger. It too was bathed in spring sunshine and never flooded, but it lay empty. That particular field hadn't produced any decent crops in a couple of years, and with costs spiralling, Flora had left nature to reclaim it. Slowly, the field had become a wildflower meadow, fresh green growth showing everywhere. In its wild way, Flora rather preferred it than the other regimented fields that had been farmed until recently on the other side of the hill. But those larger fields wouldn't be farmed anymore either. The hill on the other side dropped sharply away, and the farm's remaining fields were all on a floodplain. It had been an ongoing battle, for ages, but the last 2 winters had been the worst, with the wettest weather on record, causing the winter harvests to fail for the 2nd year in a row. And now, with the sale of the farm equipment, they couldn't be farmed anymore anyway. At the bottom of the hill, Flora continued along the wide, stony track into the woods. After being bathed in the early morning sun, the woods briefly felt darker and cooler, until she stepped out into a leafy glade where the trees had been cleared a long time ago. In the distance, she could see the glistening water of the River Lea through the trees as it wound its way from nearby Cranbridge village onwards through the countryside. Around 2 decades ago, when the flooding had caused problems further down the river one winter, Flora's granddad had dug out a large amount of earth to widen the bank of the river on their land and created a huge natural pond. It had helped slow down any floodwater, using nature to protect the villages and farms upstream from any damage. Over the years since, nature had slowly reclaimed the space, and it had become a magical place to Flora. Fed from the river and safely away from the muddy fields, the water was crystal clear. The sun was dappled as it lit up the water through the surrounding circle of trees. Birdsong filled the air, and on the far side of the pond, a couple of moorhens were preparing their nest for the arrival of their chicks. It looked almost fairy-like that morning, and for a moment her hands twitched to paint the view before the light changed. It had been years since Flora had painted anything, since leaving art college, in fact. All of her paints and drawing pads were under her bed, gathering dust. Much like her, thought Flora, allowing herself a smile of grim humour. She was becoming fed up of being the sensible one, as her friends always told her she was. She wanted wild passion and excitement in her life before it was too late. Harriet and Katie had both found unexpected love in recent months, and Libby was always travelling off to somewhere exotic with her job as a flight attendant, dating pilots and visiting amazing places. Flora secretly envied her friends' happiness and rich lives, but she didn't have the luxury of excitement when she had to keep the farm afloat for both her and Grams. Her 20s had passed by in the blink of an eye, and it was likely that her 30s would go the same way. She hadn't even dipped her feet in the water in front of her in recent years, as the busy summers on the farm had taken up so much of her time. Well, it was sunny now, she thought, looking at a wide ray of light across the water. The sensible part of Flora reminded her that it was only April and the water would likely be freezing cold. But the other part of her, the part that she had thought hidden so deep inside that it rarely surfaced anymore, suddenly sprang to life. It told her that she had nothing to lose. She suddenly decided that for once she was going to do something ridiculous and impetuous. She was going to follow her heart and just enjoy herself without the ever-present worry of money, work, and duty. Flora swiftly moved forward to stand next to one of the large boulders on the side of the lake and flung off her wellies. Next came the socks and then her jeans. She quickly shrugged off her jacket before taking off her jumper and t-shirt in one swoop of her arms. Then, in just her underwear, she stepped around the boulder and waded into the clear water. She gasped at the extreme cold, but she went further in until she was standing up to her shoulders in the water. It was sharp, almost painfully cold on her skin, but it reminded her that she was still young and free, that she was still alive. Why had it been so long since she had done this, she wondered. Perhaps she should begin taking a few risks now and then, she decided. She sank down into the freezing water and lay on her back, floating and staring up at the blue sky above. She spread her arms out wide, and for the first time in such a long time, she felt at peace. But just as she had reached a calm state of mind, she suddenly heard a deep male voice call out from somewhere nearby. "Is this a private party, or can anyone join in?" Flora quickly rose up in the water, spinning around to find out who had spoken. She stared in horror as she saw a handsome man leaning on the bonnet of a red Ferrari and smiling at her, whilst Flora stood there in just her underwear, in the middle of the lake. Chapter 2. Nico Rossi had woken up in the driver's seat of the Ferrari with a crick in his neck and an aching back. The classic sports car might be glorious to look at, but it was certainly not a great choice for sleeping accommodation. He had arrived in Cranfield in the middle of the night, after a long drive from the port of Dover. In the darkness of the countryside, the car had bounced along the potholed lane leading to Strawberry Hill Farm. However, it was so late that he hadn't wanted to wake up his grandfather's elderly friend. After a search on the internet came up with no hotels in the vicinity, he had crept the car past the farmhouse and followed the lane, where it became a track, and parked up where it ended. He had endured a restless, uncomfortable night in the narrow seat, but dawn had brought glorious spring sunshine. Feeling exhausted, he had clambered out of the car and made it as far as leaning on the bonnet, willing himself to wake up in the fresh air and wishing he had a strong cup of espresso to drink. He hadn't even realised he had parked next to a small lake in the darkness the previous evening. It was certainly a beautiful setting, somewhat magical, with the rays of sun shining across the water. He felt a moment of peace. However, his solitude was broken as an attractive brunette arrived nearby. He had been about to call out a greeting when he found himself watching in total bemusement as she suddenly stripped off down to her underwear and waded into the water right in front of him. At first, he thought he must have been dreaming, but to his surprise and immense pleasure, he realised that she was most definitely real. She was currently standing up to her waist in the water, glaring at him.
"Who are you?" she snapped, trying to cover her bra with her hands. "You're trespassing on my land."
"Then I suggest you come out of the water and arrest me," replied Nico smoothly, his English perfect, despite his words carrying a soft Italian accent. He couldn't help but smile at her. She looked so delightfully indignant, standing there with her long dark hair plastered against her creamy skin. She looked like a beautiful but extremely angry water nymph.
"I shall call the police," she carried on, with a toss of her long hair, which caused the water to ripple out from where she stood.
"From over there? That's a trick I'd like to see," he replied, "especially because I can see your mobile sticking out of your coat pocket." They both glanced over at her pile of clothes, still lying on the boulder at the side of the lake, before looking back up at each other. He guessed that the water must be absolutely freezing cold, considering it was April, and finally stopped teasing her. After all, he did try to be a true Italian gentleman, despite his infamous surname. "It's okay. Come on out," he called. "I'll turn my back to give you what's left of your dignity." He did as he had promised, turning away to head around the car and open the door. He reached in to find a towel from the bags that filled the space behind the driving seat. In fact, every nook and cranny of the Ferrari was crammed with as many of his possessions as he'd been able to pack. He then checked his mobile, and by the time he had done all that, he was aware that the woman had come to stand on the other side of the car, now fully dressed. He straightened up and looked across the bonnet at her. Even from that distance, he could see the flash of her green eyes and the water droplets on her thick, dark eyelashes. Her face glowed from a life seemingly spent outdoors, he thought. Her skin still gleamed wet from the water as she stood there in a jumper and jeans, holding a wax jacket. "Here," he said, holding out the towel for her to take. "I thought you might need this." She hesitated before taking it from him, shooting him a look of distrust as she did so.
"Thank you,"
she said, before using the towel to dry her face and hands. "I apologize for disrupting your wild swim," he said, digging a hand into his jeans pocket. It really was quite cold in the morning air. "I didn't mean to frighten you." He looked around. "I must confess, I can see why Nonno raved about the place so much over the years."
"Nonno?"
she said, with a confused frown. "My grandfather, Lorenzo Rossi." He moved around the car to stand in front of her. "Nico Rossi," he said, holding out his hand. "Buongiorno."
"I'm Flora Barton," she told him, taking his hand to give it a firm shake. "Helen Barton's granddaughter."
Up close, she was even more beautiful than he had initially thought, although those incredible green eyes were still flicking him skeptical glances. "Well, Flora," he said, "now that you've had your morning swim, how about we get in my car and you can introduce me to your grandmother?"
"Go? In this?" she asked, staring down at the Ferrari with incredulity.
"If you're going to go anywhere in life, why not do it in style?" he said, giving her a smile as he walked back around to the driver's door. But she still didn't seem keen, and remained hovering next to the car.
"I can walk back instead. I'm soaking wet," she reminded him. "I'm sure you don't want me to ruin your fancy car."
He shrugged his shoulders. "It's over 40 years old and used to be owned by one extremely disreputable playboy," he told her. "I'm sure it's seen a lot worse over the years than a few drops of water." Not waiting for her answer, he climbed inside behind the wheel. He couldn't blame her for being a bit amazed at the car. He had been the same the first time his father had brought it home. To a 6-year-old boy, it had been amazing to be driven around in a supercar on the narrow lanes of Tuscany. Now, all these years later, and at the age of 34, it belonged to him. Sort of. The passenger door finally opened, and Flora sat down next to him, having placed the towel on the seat first to protect the leather from her wet jeans. The engine started with a throaty roar, and he managed to complete a 3-point turn, avoiding the many trees and boulders that surrounded them. "Back up the track, I presume?" he asked, as they slowly drove through the woods. Flora nodded, still staring around the inside of the car in amazement.
"Yes."
"You've never been in a Ferrari before?" he said. "It's very nice, don't you think?"
"If you like that kind of thing,"
she told him, turning away to look out of the window. He was getting the impression that Flora Barton wasn't impressed by anything, least of all him. In a way, it was somewhat refreshing. Most of the women he came into contact with were starstruck by the association with his famous father. All the romances had been short-lived once he realised that all they wanted was a piece of fame. He had long since given up dating anyone over the last couple of years. "And you don't like that kind of thing?" he prompted, slowly driving out of the woods.
"I don't suppose it's any good at ploughing fields," she replied.
He glanced out of the window. One appeared to have been left to run wild. The other, much smaller field had rows of tiny green plants. But that was it. He wondered why it was so quiet. It was April, and surely the place should be buzzing with activity. His own family vineyard back in Tuscany had come alive in the spring. There had always been much to do at that time, preparing the vines and ensuring the coming harvest would be as good as it could be. But it was spring now, and there would be no more harvests ever again. The vineyard had gone, and all that Nico had left was his name. The trouble was that his father had dishonoured the Rossi name so many times that even that was tainted. The famous surname still held a certain appeal for some people, though. But if all people want from you is your famous name, who can you trust? Nico had decided a long time ago that he couldn't trust anyone. As he drove up the hill, the farmhouse came into view. He couldn't help but be charmed by the sight of the sandy-coloured brick L-shape building with its terracotta pots of overflowing herbs by the front door, all lit by the early morning sunshine. There was a cheery charm about the place. It was a home, obviously cared for by a loving family. For a moment, his breath caught in his throat as he thought about his own family home back in Italy. It too had been a large house overlooking their land, full of life and laughter. His grandparents had liked to entertain their friends and neighbours there. His father had liked to show off the vineyard to his many girlfriends. Nico had viewed it as a sanctuary, the only place where he had felt secure and loved for himself, not his famous name. His father, Paolo, had been a gifted footballer who had risen to the heights of superstardom playing for Inter Milan. Alongside his footballing career, Paolo had also enjoyed a colourful love life, catalogued throughout the tabloids each and every week. The women loved his charm and good looks, as well as the substantial salary he was paid. Paolo's life was jam-packed full of fast women, fast cars, and fine wine. Nico was a result of a string of one-night affairs, with his young mother apparently leaving him on his father's doorstep at only a few weeks old. She had never wanted the child and had refused to be a part of his life. Paolo was big on personality and charm, not so good with parenting. Unable to cope with a young baby, Nico had been dumped on his grandparents at the family home in Tuscany. They were the only other family that Nico had, and thankfully, they adored him. He found himself loved and mentored by them in their steady, reassuring way. Even so, in the early days, Nico had longed for Paolo's infrequent visits. His father would bring an eclectic mix of toys and treats and, usually to his own parents' displeasure, a different girlfriend with him every time as well. But suddenly, Paolo's football career had been cut short. Bored and listless without his beloved football to keep him occupied, he tried out various money-making schemes and investments with varying degrees of success. Paolo lost his fortune as quickly as he had made it, over and over. Sometimes he got lucky and would return to Tuscany in his famous Ferrari, showering gifts over everyone. Most of the time, he was absent, disappearing for months, sometimes years on end, whilst he tried to recoup the inevitable heavy losses incurred after yet another failed business venture. But whenever he returned, Nico still let him back into his life and continued to forgive him. After all, despite everything, Paolo was his father. For a while, Nico had even emulated his success with women. With his good looks and Rossi charm, he had dated a string of women in his 20s. But the frivolousness of endless dating and glamour had quickly paled. He didn't want to turn into his philandering father. He wanted something true, something honest, and was still searching for that woman who didn't want him just for the fame. He wanted what his grandparents had had all those years: companionship, trust, and true love. After studying business at university, he had returned to the vineyard armed with new ideas and excitement for what the future held for them all. He had poured nearly every last penny that he owned into investing for the future of the vineyard. He had put in place new eco-friendly bottling techniques, promoted customer experiences, and even purchased a couple of drones to oversee the vast fields of vines. For a while, they had all reaped the success of his hard work, and the future of the vineyard was looking extremely prosperous. But the last time Paolo had come home, after his latest business venture had inevitably gone bust, everything had already begun to change. Nico's beloved grandmother had just passed away, and Lorenzo was struggling in his grief to concentrate on business matters. Nico had taken control of the vineyard, with his grandfather's blessing, but Paolo decided he wanted to take over the family business himself, stating that he could triple their profits in a few short months. Lorenzo had passed away a short while later, still hoping that his family home would be passed down to his grandson. But his wishes were only ever verbal, and so everything had passed to Paolo instead. Shortly after, the family home, the vineyard, all of it, was sold to the highest bidder, and despite fighting the sale every inch of the way, 1 week ago Nico had lost his home. The only home he had ever known. Everything was gone, including his grandparents, the only people he had ever truly trusted and counted on. He was lost and heartbroken. And angry, he realised. His father had taken everything away, so it was only right and fair that Nico should take something of Paolo's as well. Therefore, the night before the house sale was completed, Nico had stolen the car keys and driven away in his father's beloved Ferrari. He had slowly driven up through Italy and then across Europe, trying to work out what to do next with his life. His dream had always been to keep his home, with the family he so dearly cherished, and perhaps one day fill it with children of his own. He loved working outside, but apart from his business degree, his only experience had been at the vineyard. And now that too was lost to him. He had no plans, except one. Whilst tidying up Lorenzo's study, Nico had come across a letter in which he had bequeathed a gift to Helen Barton and left the address for Strawberry Hill Farm. So Nico had come to England to honour his grandfather's wish. After all, he had no idea where he would go next. The Rossi name was tainted in Tuscany, thanks to his father's misdemeanours. Nico was aware that the scandals had tarred his own name with the same brush, and nearly everyone that he had contacted for work or a temporary place to stay had slammed the door in his face. And from the distrustful looks that Flora was still giving him, she looked as if she was tempted to do exactly the same. Chapter 3. Flora squirmed in the leather car seat in embarrassment, but the movement only served to remind her that her jeans were soaking wet from where she had quickly got dressed after getting out of the lake. She was completely and utterly mortified. The one time in recent years when she had thrown caution to the wind, and she had been found in only her underwear by a complete stranger. If that wasn't a reminder to live a sensible life, then she wasn't sure what was. She glanced over at Nico Rossi, as he drove up the hill. So, this was Lorenzo's grandson that Grams had spoken about. The words Italian playboy certainly rang true, given the flash car she now found herself in. He drove a Ferrari, for goodness sake. The man was a walking cliché, even down to his dishevelled dark good looks and sexy accent. Flora's cheeks grew hot as she thought of him seeing her cheap black bra and knickers. It was just too much to bear. He had seen her at her most vulnerable. And it unsettled her. OK, he had offered her a towel and turned his back whilst she got dressed, but she was certain that being an old-fashioned gentleman was probably part of his charm routine. Hadn't Grams said something about all the men in his family being playboys? When he parked up the supercar next to her old, battered Land Rover, the contrast couldn't have been more extreme. She leapt out of the car, desperate to put some distance between them. Thankfully, a distraction happened, in the form of Grams, heading out of the door and into the courtyard to see what the— "My word!" she exclaimed, looking on in wonder at the Ferrari. "What a car!" "Always happy to take a beautiful lady such as yourself out for a spin," said Nico as he climbed out of the driver's seat. Grams merely looked delighted. "Oh, you are so like Lorenzo back in the day," she said with a chuckle. Flora managed not to roll her eyes and studied him instead. Not knowing anything about Lorenzo, she had no comparisons to hold him up against. Nico had wavy dark hair, a Roman nose and dark eyes. His skin looked the type to go instantly bronze as soon as summer arrived. He was tall, dark and rather annoyingly good-looking. She felt supremely irritated by him. She knew it was embarrassment on her part. Why hadn't she been driving her tractor, feeling confident and in her comfort zone, instead of dripping wet, half naked in the middle of the lake when he found her? Nico walked towards Grams and held out his hand. "Mrs. Barton, buongiorno. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. I'm Nico Rossi." "And I'm Helen. Let's dispense with the formalities, shall we?" said Grams, stepping forward to draw Nico into a hug. Her tiny stature only emphasised his tall body as he gently returned the embrace. "Let me take a look at you," said Grams, stepping back to stare up at Nico. "You are a chip off the old block, I must say. The spitting image of your grandfather. Dear Lorenzo. I can't believe he's gone when he was always so full of life. What a character he was." Nico gave her a sad smile. "Thank you for your letter," he said in a soft tone. "Your words were a great comfort to me." Grams gave a heavy sigh. "I was so sad not to attend the funeral, but I'm not up to plane rides these days." She shot a look at the Ferrari once more. "But I'm looking forward to heading out in that gorgeous beast at some point." Nico laughed. "Any time you want to spin, just say the word." He looked across at Flora, but she was thankful to see his laugh falter a bit as he met the glare of her eyes. Grams, too, glanced over at her and gave a start. "What happened to you?" she asked, her eyes wide. "You're all wet."
"I fell over,"
lied Flora.
"Underwater?"
asked Grams, somewhat bewildered.
"I'll go change,"
replied Flora, heading towards the open door. Behind her, she could hear Grams and Nico laughing over something, and she felt even more rattled. Grams wasn't friends with handsome Italian playboys. Grams was steady, secure. She was a farmer and she was sensible, just like Flora. Wasn't she? Flora stalked through the spacious kitchen, down the narrow hallway and up the staircase. It wasn't a large farmhouse, but it was plenty big enough for the two of them. It had 4 bedrooms. Grams, of course, had the master bedroom, and Flora, in the hope of making more money, or at least trying to stay afloat financially, Flora had given the other 2 bedrooms an extremely cheap makeover, and they had been mildly successful for a while in renting the rooms out through Airbnb in the autumn. But a winter storm had ripped some of the tiles off the roof, and now one of the bedrooms and the bathroom both leaked every time it rained. So there had been no more visitors, and the money had dried up once more. Flora went into her bedroom and shut the door, leaning back against it. What a morning, and it was barely 8 o'clock yet. She looked across at the picture on her bedside cabinet, a picture of her grandparents looking happy and relaxed as they stood in the middle of the strawberry field. It had been taken many years ago, when the farm had been successful, and they had all been together. She thought back to the conversation earlier with Joe, and the selling of all the farm equipment. Now what? For all of his expertise, Joe didn't have any answers as to where their future lay. The majority of the fields were on a floodplain, so couldn't be sold off for building purposes, nor could they be used for farming. With nothing left for them to sell except the farmhouse, Joe had been stumped for ideas, and so had Flora. They could only hang on to the farmhouse with some new type of income. But what? For a moment, Flora had a daydream of taking on a normal job and having the weekends off to lie in the warm sun and relaxing, something she rarely did, maybe even taking up painting again. But she suddenly felt restless, unsettled by what the future held. At the sound of laughter outside, she headed over to the window. Nico was showing Grams the inside of the Ferrari, and they were both laughing along. At a crossroads in her life, the last thing Flora needed was some smooth playboy coming over and distracting Grams. Hard decisions needed to be made, and they could hardly have those kinds of conversations when Nico was there. Flora determinedly looked away at the rest of the view. Her room overlooked the strawberry field, and the empty one, next door. It too was now left to fallow. In fact, it had ended up making them more money than with crops the previous summer, being used as a car park for the visitors to the lavender fields. At the far end of the field, and across the narrow path towards the much larger village of Cranbridge, were 2 large fields, planted with lavender. Owned by her best friend Harriet, the fields had been opened up to the public for the first time, with huge success the previous summer. Harriet had been successful in love as well, having fallen for Joe, with whom she now lived in a cottage on Railway Lane. On the opposite side of the railway tracks was the old railway station. The railway line had long since been closed, so Harriet had turned the small post room at the far end of the station into a successful spa, using her talent as a beauty. Next to the spa was the main part of the station, which had been turned into a successful coffee shop and restaurant, thanks to her friend Katie, who lived and worked there with her boyfriend Ryan. The last of her group of friends was Libby, who was Harriet's neighbour in one of the cottages just along from the station. She worked as an airline flight attendant and was often away on trips abroad, just how free-spirited Libby preferred it. But when she was home, they always met up. Flora was pleased with her friends' success, both in their careers and in love. It seemed that only her own position was financially precarious. She didn't really care about the lack of a love life, however. She prided herself on being sensible, practical and level-headed. Love had no place in her ordered way of life, whatever Grams might wish for her. Hearing Nico roar with laughter once more, Flora turned away from the window to get dressed into warm, dry clothes, all the while grinding her teeth in irritation. Grams had talked about Nico's famous father, and so Flora brought out her phone to Google him. There were plenty of images for Flora to gaze at in open-mouthed amazement. Paolo Rossi seemed to be always having one scandal after another in the tabloids. Then, to her horror, she saw that his son was listed in similar stories. The photographs all seemed to be of one girlfriend or another, flashing light bulbs and all the tabloid titillation of a Eurotrash lifestyle. Flora flung her phone down onto her bed with a howl of dismay. He certainly wasn't to be trusted whilst he was visiting them. She had to protect her grandmother. The sooner Nico Rossi left Cranfield, the better, as far as she was concerned. Chapter 4. Having heard so much about the summer his grandfather had spent at bustling Strawberry Hill Farm all those years ago, Nico was somewhat surprised that there was no one else around except Grams and her granddaughter. He had been invited inside to sit in the surprisingly colourful farmhouse kitchen. It was large and clean, but also full of the aroma of home cooking, with the nearby range giving out a cheery warmth. A familiar perfume twitched his senses, and he looked around until he spotted a pot of basil on the windowsill. The reminder of the sweet smell of his grandmother's Italian kitchen made him catch his breath. Nico took a grateful sip of the hot coffee that Grams had just handed him. "Grazie, Helen," he said. "Thank you. I need this."
"You must call me Grams," she replied. "After all, you're like family to me. And you should have just knocked on the door last night rather than sleeping in your car," she added in a stern voice, having now discovered that he had fallen asleep in his car overnight.
Nico shook his head. "I wouldn't have dreamt of disturbing you," he replied. After all, Grams might have the spirit and eyes of a young woman, but she was 80 years old now. Still, he could see the passion and drive that his grandfather